Thank you for joining us today. My name is Allison Ban, and I'm the Executive Director at Spark, the Center for Social Research Innovation. Welcome to today's Spark Talk, Mapping Literature with Networks. I'd like us to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us, and to recognize our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship that Indigenous peoples have to this land. Adeline Lo is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She researches factors that motivate or mitigate conflict between groups and focuses on migrant inclusionary politics, though also designs statistical tools for inference, prediction, and measurement for applied social science data. Her work has been published or is forthcoming in journals such as the American Political Science Review, Political Analysis and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the kind invitation. I'm just going to share my screen. And if you can see it, if I could just get it perfect. Thank you. Just in case. Oh, thank you so much for coming to this talk on Friday, especially. I know that the weekend beckons. This is a project that I really enjoyed working on simply because I'm a methodologist by training and I work a lot on migrant politics. But I spent a lot of time as a junior scholar trying to poke into new literatures. And so this was born out of my lack of knowledge, actually, in a particular literature that I was going into with some colleagues on American politics redistricting. So for those of you who know American politics, we have this bizarre setup where there's severe redistricting and gerrymandering. And I knew very little about it. Even as an American, I just knew of it. And so I found myself needing to create, as usual, a literature review, but feeling a little bit overwhelmed by it and feeling this process could be sped up and bettered in certain ways. And this was the project that was born out of it. So it's called Mapping Literature with Networks, an application to redistricting. And this is joint with our former grad students, Devin Judge Lord, who's now at UMichigan, and Kyler Hudson, and a colleague of mine in UW-Madison, Ken Meyer, who actually does know a lot about redistricting. So this was a very good way for us to post something and then check that it passed his sanity check in terms of what we came out with in terms of the redistricting literature. And please feel free to interrupt as we go along. I like to give lectures the way I teach. I like to be interrupted and I like to be told when you would like more or less or don't understand, because then I know where I can start fixing things. Okay, like I said before, and I'm motivated, literature reviews are our bread and butter as academics, but also for policymakers and anyone trying to understand a new topic, which is very common for junior scholars in particular. As long as you're trying to learn new things, you're probably going to do a literature review. And generally what we're trying to do when we conduct a literature review is identify what's known, figure out what's unknown, maybe find things that are good for productive research. You might have heard this called gaps in the literature, finding gaps. And so a literature should ostensibly include several things. It might have expert knowledge, maybe not if you're especially new to it, but it might have it, and systematic search of published work. It generally includes funding and organizing all prior studies using a schema of choice, whichever you prefer. And it often ends with some open-ended research questions. What are paths that we can take to try to move that frontier of research forward? But what a research literature review often entails is actually an ad hoc collection of literature with sometimes an unconscious application of heuristics. And this might just be because you're familiar with certain types of work. You might bring to bear citation patterns, and you might defer to certain types of author prestige. And among everything else, all of this unconscious application, you might just have higher barriers to entry for juniors or scholars new to a topic. So as you may often see, review pieces tend to be done by folks who really have worked on this for a while. And that may make a lot of sense, but we also don't have a sense of whether they too are unconsciously applying heuristics. So what we see as the contribution in this work is hopefully offering a possible transparent method to uncover broad patterns in literature reviews. And I'm going to try to push on you a few things, a few reasons why this may be useful for you. And it isn't for everyone, but hopefully there are a few scenarios in here where you find yourself thinking, maybe this would be easy to apply and easy to use. So this approach is a network-based one. And you can think of a network generally as a social network where you have actors as nodes and edges. So those are relationships that might occur between those actors. Here, we're going to conceive of actors as concepts. So things that we conceptually think about for a particular topic. And the edges are the theorized relationships between those concepts. So in this toy example I have here, we have a piece of literature that has conceptualized concept A and concept B and posits that A actually affects B, right? And another piece of literature that conceptualizes B as affecting C. And so far in this literature, we haven't seen, given our sweep, our mini sweep in this toy example, we haven't seen something that directly posits or theorizes that A should affect C. But if we were to build this out, we would essentially build up a large network with a certain number of nodes, which equates to the number of concepts that are discussed in this literature, and edges that are drawn between them that equate to literature that has discussed how one thing affects another, one node affects another. And so we can analyze all of this graph, this network graph, for its entire structure as well as patterns. And what I'm going to argue is that the questions that we often pose in literature reviews actually really naturally get mapped into questions you can ask of a network. And that there are quantitative takeaways that you can get from asking those network questions that you can map right back to literature review questions. So some benefits to this approach include a transparent sort of approach and the choices of the universe of studies. So what goes into your network is these are the guidelines that I'm going to use. This is what creates the sample. And so then the network itself is composed of items that you have to be clear about. The second is that network graphs can display broad and complex patterns that are hard to find with human imagination. So it might be quite easy actually for you to, especially once you've ruminated in the literature for a while, to have a sense of, well, I know that this work posits these types of relationships, and I know that this work posits these types, and I can connect them in some way. But imagine if you were to expand the number of works to 20, 30, 50, 100, then the imagination of types of patterns that can occur become a little bit harder for the human imagination. And network graphs are one way to just put that out there, and you can look from a global standpoint what might be appearing in the literature landscape. We also believe that the evidence for assertions about prior knowledge in this setting make it easy to produce and critique and replicate and extend. So to some extent, another motivation behind this project was that I have terrible memory and am inherently slightly lazy when it comes to literature reviews. And so constantly redoing them is, forgive the language, a pain in the butt. So one of the hopes in this work was to be able to conduct a literature review and only add towards it. So basically only build up the literature that I have and not have to redo all the work every single time. And to some extent, the way that we've set this up should make it reasonably easy to do something like that. The network of concepts, as well as we map them out, as we read through the literature, map them into the network, we can also use this setup towards causal graphs and causal identification. Suppose, I'm going to talk more about this. Suppose we think that A influences B and another piece of literature indicates that B influences C. Well, to some extent, you've already seen that the effect of A to C is at least mediated potentially through B. But it could not be. It could be a heterogeneous treatment effect. But it's something to explore that's already elicited in the process of looking at this literature review. So we see this as helpful also for scholars who are thinking about causal questions, being able to theorize around that with the full knowledge of the prior literature, specifically toward causal pathways. I would like to put out some caveats, though. This is not like going to fix all your problems. In particular, reviews of research are as biased as the sample of work that comprises it. And so this particular approach isn't going to de-bias. That's just not possible. What we hope this can do is that it might be clearer where you are biased. So if you're pulling literature from only a particular series of sources, at least you're honest about where it comes from, who is being cited, what is being shown, and therefore also, to some extent, what isn't being shown. It also, in writing out where things are coming from, you might already have a sense of where you can start pulling out more literature from different sources across the internet, across social networks, et cetera. So this is just about being clear about where you're pulling your sample rather than necessarily debiasing that. Okay, so I mentioned that one of the nice things about the setup is that we think of literature review questions as mapping really nicely to network questions. And there are three categories of these types of questions that we can think about in the broad schema of assess and identify, and then I'm going to talk about explore, and then isolate. So assess and identify are the first common questions that we often see in a literature review. What is the global summary of the current research on this topic? How complete is it? What are the key concepts that the literature has focused on? What are things that folks have spent a lot of time hammering in on? And what are communities of work that have developed, right? So these are maybe groups of scholars that have been speaking to one another within this topic. So capturing that may be of interest to us in just figuring out what our landscape looks like. What we see this as is it may be really easy to summarize pairs of concepts. I'm going to call these dyads, right? So any two nodes together that we may have an edge between it. This is straightforward. So we can think about that pretty easily as scholars. But those global connections are harder to think about. And in mapping all of these concepts and their edges between them into a network, we can identify key concepts as translating to essentially finding central nodes. Those are the types of concepts that are talked about or toward a lot. And finding communities of work actually relates really nicely to discovering network communities. And both of these are entrenched in the basics of network analysis. And so to some extent, the tools are there and we just have to pull from that. A second set of questions is on exploration, right? We do literature reviews in part to understand what's going on, but we also want to understand what hasn't gone on. And so what are areas for theoretical exploration? What are bodies of work that can or should be connected? And what are unconnected causal concepts? And finally, where are areas that are under empirically validated? So these are all the types of questions that we push ourselves and push our colleagues and students to think about in terms of adding to the literature. Where are those gaps? It could be that there's theory that could be developed, and it could be that they're empirically based questions that haven't actually been validated. So someone has posited that A actually affects B across a whole bunch of scenarios, but it hasn't actually been shown. So that too is a contribution that has not yet been made. So the network framework makes finding essentially those missing links reasonably straightforward, because what you're looking for are where you might have cycles A to B to C, and it's just not finished the connection of A to C. Now, of course, not every missing link should be pursued, but these are reasonable places to already start looking physically on a graph where you might already see opportunities of exploring why hasn't that been discussed. Maybe there's a good reason, maybe just it doesn't seem reasonable in that setting that A should influence C on its own. But maybe it's just a place where the literature has yet to bear fruit and you can add to it. So these are places where we think finding gaps is actually very visually easy. The last set of questions that we often think about and ask are a little bit more related to if you're interested in causal questions. So you might ask, what are causal pathways related to a theorized concept? So your theory may already posit that A influences B. But in order to be fully thorough about it, right, we generally think about this in an identification setting. And that means we need to think about things like confounders. So what are things that are upstream of my treatment? What are things that are downstream of my DV? And what are confounders that are possible that are simultaneously affecting my treatment and my DV, right? And a literature review that places everything into a network naturally offers you the ability to just go look at that. You might also be interested in the confounding concepts. And so we think about this as clarifying causal relationships and potential confounding pathways by looking at the scholarship that forms the local neighborhood of that dyad that you're interested in. So if you focus there and you look all around it, that actually consists of what the literature currently speaks to about your pathway that you're interested in. This we compress into a table in the work that this framework can come out in. And this is just table one, where I'm grouping, assess and identify, explore, isolate, and control into the first column, which is the literature questions. This is just replicating the literature questions that you might generally have, into what the network question looks like. What are the key concepts that the literature is focused on? That's asking what are central nodes to some extent, right? And there is a corresponding network statistic that maps exactly to it. So centrality. You might think of lots of different versions of centrality, local degree, global vertex, et cetera. But these are all versions of capturing how important is this node in terms of collecting edges in the general graph. We might also have what are areas that are under empirically validated in the explore section, right? So these are, as we place our graphs out of all of the literature, we can code for whether every single one of those edges was theorized and empirically validated, or only empirical, no theory behind it. In mapping our graphs, we just compare the difference between what is theorized and what is empirically validated. And exact comparisons of two networks for those differential types of edges will tell us where something is under empirically validated or under theorized. And so that's also something that's naturally offered through a network statistic. So these are all examples of where we can map literature question to network statistic or network takeaway. And I'm going to walk through some examples on the very far right column as we go through the redistricting example. But just to think about the algorithmic steps to creating a literature network, so I'm going to walk through this and then we're going to actually basically do it together. So the first step that we conceive is that you select the studies. Perhaps you select the studies using topic-associated keywords by soliciting suggestions from domain area experts and iteratively searching and selecting a few articles highly related to the topic or phrases. So this is just to say, you started on redistricting and maybe you poked your colleague, Ken Meyer, who actually knows something about it, and say, what are good keywords I should be using on Google Scholar or anywhere else where I've decided to search for literature on this? I'm realizing. Oh, I'm just looking at the chat. Sorry. Interested in. Okay. So you might be poking just for some of those keywords, and then you use them to guide how you search for different literatures. And you might use those phrases to snowball sample related keywords. So maybe you find that redistricting is actually highly related to gerrymandering, and that gerrymandering is highly related to partisan bias. And so you pull these together, select and finalize your keywords, and then use these to implement criteria for a time frame. Maybe you focus on a particular decade, outlets, which journals or which news articles, et cetera, that you want to focus on, and the extent to which the outlet features those keywords. Can it appear in the title, the abstract, the body of the work, et cetera? But these are all rules you've decided to guide yourself by, and you can write them out. And this essentially finalizes a set of works that constitute the body of literature to review. You get a set of papers, essentially. In step 2, this is what we conceive of as slightly different, but ultimately the same in substance for how you do literature reviews in general. So for every single work, we usually read it, regurgitate it in some way, shape, or form, in the form of notes on your computer, in Post-its, in your great memory, however you've decided to keep all of that information. We see here a change where we're going to ask you to put, for every single work, a single row in a spreadsheet with information on the study, so title, author, et cetera, concepts studied in this study, these are the nodes, their connections, and information pertinent to nodes or edges. So these are attributes, and I'll go through what these are. And then after you've input sort of row by row all of your studies, you're going to end up with essentially what's called an edge list. And you can then start porting this into sort of network language and refer to table 1 for the questions that can be asked of the literature network, and visualize patterns in the related network or network components. Let's see this in action, actually. We're going to focus on the redistricting application, which following the 2020 US Census, this whole topic sort of attracted attention of courts, politicians, and the public, and it highlights the importance of district boundaries to political outcomes. Essentially, redistricting is chopping up areas in a given state such that it may include or not include certain portions and certain populations, and has been used before for political purposes, such that you might have for instance, a state that has a lot of distribution of the two parties, Democrats and Republicans. And if you were to sort of circle different districts, let's say 5 districts in it, in a reasonably contiguous manner, you would cookie cut sort of 5 different areas that have reasonably similar Democrat and Republican proportions in each one. What redistricting has been used for, and why it comes with a lot of political attention, is you can not cookie cutter car, but rather take a pen and try to pull in certain areas and exclude certain others, such that it manifests as political gain for one party or another in an election. So you might swoop in some of your own constituents into a few extra of those districts, and then just leave the one remainder that's oddly shaped that includes all of your opponents in an effort to win as many districts as possible compared to your opponents. So that's the gist of what redistricting's political issues are in the United States, very roughly summarized. Okay, let's imagine then we're a researcher very new to studying redistricting, as I was, and we're going to conduct a literature review. So first, we find the relevant sample of literature. So what are the studies that we're actually going to focus on? And this selection criteria, we're going to base on predefined and replicable rules. So we'll write these down, and then we're just going to follow them. We can go back and tweak and just follow it again. But ultimately, what this is going to be is a mapping, a set of rules that we followed to get the sample that we got. So we can always go back and judge the rules, but at least they're clear. We're going to use journal rankings, citations, and all within the last 10 years. We're going to focus, because this is the political science crowd, on 6 highly ranked political science journals, 2 journals specific to American politics, and the Election Law Journal. The reasoning behind this, which we write in a little paragraph to remind ourselves why we had these rules, is because we want political science journals that have the breadth that could cover redistricting as a topic. So that includes the first 6. We want the subfield that obviously tends to cover redistricting as a topic. That would be the second set. And finally, Election Law Journal has traditionally covered redistricting in the past, so it makes sense to include it. And then we're going to conduct keyword searches among articles in the last decade in all of these outlets, containing from our garnered starting keywords: efficiency gap, gerrymander, partisan symmetry, and redistrict. And just to wrap things up, because of course there are lots of articles that may be highly influential and have been mentioned and utilized across the sciences and social sciences that wouldn't appear necessarily in these outlets. So we're going to Google Scholar for any peer-reviewed article with over 50 citations in this time period that includes a key phrase in the title or abstract. So this sort of rounds out our articles. This results in 115 articles that we're going to survey for this literature review. Just so you have a sense, in 2020, there was an annual review of political science piece that was on a literature review of redistricting, and that covered roughly 50 to 60 articles. So we're going a little bit stretching the boundaries, in part because we want to make sure that we're covering a decent amount of outlets, but potentially we're covering very different outlets as well. We're going to read each work and identify the main concepts and connections posited between them. So what we essentially start off with are a group of articles, and we just read through them the way we usually would for a literature review. But the difference here is we're going to identify in every single one of them very clearly the main concepts that are posited in them. Those are our notes. And then whether there are any connections posited between them. Now, in some cases, it may just be that you're going to talk about a concept such as contiguousness. So how contiguous a particular geographic boundary is something of contention in redistricting, something that people care about as districts are being drawn. And an article may simply be about, how do we measure this? What is a reasonable way of measuring this? And in that case, that is the concept contiguousness that the article is focusing on. And it's a self-tie in the sense that it's going to be talking about how we measure it itself, right? Another example might be Kane et al. 2017, which focuses on the concept of independent redistricting commissions and partisan advantage. So whether independent redistricting commissions lead to potentially less or more partisan advantage, and posit that commissions like these are unlikely to produce extremely partisan maps, in part because we expect that these independent commissions are much more separated from political influences, and therefore might be much more likely to stamp away very ridiculously drawn partisan maps. And we can record this as a directed edge from independent redistricting commission. with an edge to partisan advantage, where we can include things like edge information, whether the effect is positive or negative. Here we think that it would be negative, as given our read of Kane et al. 2017. And we can also identify the number and identity of works as edge attributes. So Kane and co-authors may not be the only ones who draw this connection between these two concepts. And in fact, we can thicken that edge with however many different works actually insist on that particular connection, right? And the thicker it is, we might think of there's even more literature on this particular takeaway. We put together a NetLit package, which is on our CRAN. You can install it and library it as just NetLit. And an example that we have, which is what I'm showing here today in the package, is you can just pull it out as the data as literature and just take a look at the data that it inputs immediately into the network statistics and graphics that you can do with the package. So this is the head of that data. We can see that we have two nodes. This is the from node, the to node. So this particular concept, number of competitive districts, as posited in Gimbel and Harbridge-Young 2020, affects preservation of communities of interest in a decreasing manner. That's the sort of posited, theorized relationship between this concept and this concept. And as you can see, there are other edges that are drawn between two concepts that can be reinforced across multiple studies, right? So Altman and McDonald 2010, Wang 2016, et cetera, all focus on this particular edge relationship. So we can build this down, and every time we read an article, just pop that right back in. And this is what I mean about not having to remember it in future. So once you've done this, hopefully in redistricting, as the literature grows and the frontier is moved, each additional year or extra years that you're starting to put back information into that literature review, you're popping this into the same spreadsheet. Thank goodness for me. So let's go back to asking those questions and seeing what it looks like in terms of answers for redistricting. So in our assess and identify category, we asked, what is the global summary of the current research? And in this setting, we can plot a network graph. We end up with, from these 115 papers, 57 concept nodes and 69 edges describing relationships between these concepts. And it looks something like this. Here are our nodes represent theoretical concepts shaded by total degree centrality. So however many works are talking about this node is how it's shaded. So the darker it's shaded, it's more works. Arrows connect concepts theorized as directional relationships in the works, colored by the numbers of works, and can be in both directions, such as might indicate an endogenous relationship. And solid edges indicate empirically studied connections, while dashed are relationships that have been theorized but not studied empirically. And so the NetLit vignette walks through production of network graphs using the graph object returned by NetLit review as a function. And the input is the literature edge list, right, that we're incorporating into our spreadsheet and then passing through into the package. So in this setup, we're already seeing that there are some nodes that might be pretty popular. These concepts are a lot more popular than others. Some concepts that are a little isolated. They don't end up speaking to the other concepts as much. And in fact, it's because there are studies here, 2 and 1, where they're studying them as things we'd like to measure, but not necessarily things that are posited as theoretically related to other concepts here. So to some extent, this is already informative for someone who came in new to the literature on what are types of literatures that are constantly jousting with one another on what influences what, and what are literatures that are measurement oriented instead. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm just curious how each concept is defined has a huge impact on the nature of the network. And so I was curious, are you picking the terminology used by the authors, or are you doing recategorization across articles?
So to some extent, this is a question that we always have to ask ourselves when we're doing a literature review, right? It could be that author A talks about partisan gerrymandering, whereas author B talks about it simply as redistricting. And being able to connect those two concepts, they're actually talking about the same thing, is something that we have to take a subjective view on, right? And so attention has to be paid to the important process of defining the nodes and edges. And this is not just in literature reviews, but also regular users of network analysis or analyses that rest on well-measured concepts. So how and what constitutes a node that represents a concept and whether it relates to something else is ultimately something that the researcher has to interpret. For instance, in this setting, we saw that there were different authors who used different language in referencing the same exact concept. So partisan bias, partisan advantage, for instance. And in these cases, what we did was employed an iterative concept naming process. So we add terms used by each author to the spreadsheet and then visualize the draft network to identify similar terms. And then after consulting the relevant articles, we consolidated the terms referring to the same concept under an umbrella term in the spreadsheet. There was iteration in this, and we made choices on certain umbrella terms. We made notes on what constitutes those umbrella terms and which papers we saw as using terms that fall under those umbrellas. To some extent, definitely subjective, interpretive, but hopefully also very transparent in our naming process. So yes, that is a really good question, because ultimately it could be that we have people taking different stances on how different terms are used. In our supplementary information for this paper, we actually did an exercise where we asked 6 IR scholars to do a similar exercise on the same 15 papers in IR and to see differences that might occur across them. And the umbrella terming does vary between them, but global statistics taken away from the literature networks that they posited were still very similar, at least had a lot of overlap. And so that makes us a little hopeful that this is a replicable process, and that even if it's not perfectly replicable, you know why maybe it isn't, and you can point to the places where deviation may have occurred. But thank you. Any other? Yes.
Hi. Yes. This question is maybe less related to the methodology, but I noticed looking at the network map, one of the nodes is pork spending. Piqued my curiosity. I was wondering if you remembered how that was related to redistricting, or if it's relating to how much people spend on like the food.
No, I think in this setting, it's giving good to in party. And so let me try to find where exactly pork spending is.
I think it's right near the center top.
Uh, Here we go. Yeah. So to some extent, it's posited as maybe you would therefore, so this is not empirically validated. This is posited that perhaps if you have alignment between House and Senate delegation, then you might be able to give more goods to your constituents. And it was not validated with empirics, but it's something that you may perhaps be happening. What we saw this as was an opportunity to think about, is that actually the case? Because House and Senate delegation alignments do occur and they switch a lot. But this has not been shown in work yet. And when we were going through this with some of the grad students who are working on the project with us, these were all like places where we thought about, if this is what your dissertation was really focused on, at the very least, you can start reading up on this and seeing if it's interesting to you, if you can make a contribution, if there's a reason why it hasn't been empirically validated, but it should be. And so, yeah, that's where we saw arrows like that come out. Yes, the NetLit package is available on R. And yes, thank you. So does that answer your question? Thank you. Okay, so that's our first global look at what does the literature landscape look like? Where are things being focused? We can already get a sense of where some attention is being made, where scholars might be speaking to one another across concepts. But what are key concepts literature is focused on? That is another question that often comes up when we focus on literature reviews. And this maps, as I said before, into a natural question of what are the central nodes? So you can calculate centrality directly off of all of those nodes. And so when we calculated our partisan advantage, so that's in the center right here, wouldn't be a surprise, hopefully, is the most central with 14 total edges. It is talked about the most across all of the literature. Efficiency gap, partisan gerrymandering, preserving communities of interest. So this last one was super interesting to us. We had a degree centrality of 8. So these are the second most common concepts that are talked about. So here we're focusing on these nodes now. And the last concept we define, so this is going back to Allison's question, as an umbrella term, covering the broad goals of preserving minority areas and political subdivisions within districts and core district retention. There were works that sort of discussed this in various different ways, but they were ultimately, from our interpretation, talking about preserving these communities of interest. And it is surprising to some extent, and it certainly was unsurprising to Ken, who does a lot of expert witnessing on these concepts of redistricting that matter in the legal sense. It's a traditional redistricting criteria and therefore is studied for it. So do you satisfy these types of these criteria, for instance, contiguousness or population proportionality, preserving communities? So these are the sorts of things that come up. We also can focus on the communities of work that have developed. So who are the scholarly works that are speaking to one another more? And this is really straightforward because there's a lot of community detection algorithms that are directly applied to network graphs that we can just harness immediately. So a group of scholars, for instance, have investigated how changes in the electorate's composition, so this is our change in constituency boundaries, can affect campaign resources and allocations and vote power. One of the reasons I think this became really popular in the last decade, which is where we focused, remember, is because electoral change through the constituency boundaries are sometimes seen as a pseudo-exogenous shock. And so being able to harness that exogenous shock and look at downstream political phenomena is really helpful for us to be able to causally identify the effect of constituency change on things like vote outcome, on work, on minority representation, et cetera. So these are all like a body of work that have cropped up in the last 10 years. Our third category of questions includes questions that are catered towards those who are interested in a causal question that they would like to answer moving forward from this literature review. So one might be, what are areas for theoretical exploration? As we noted before, this is a very straightforward thing that we can get from the network approach, which is just find your missing edges and focus on thinking about why are they missing? What is happening there? This doesn't mean any missing edge is something you should focus on, but it does mean that missing edges are places where people haven't focused on. And maybe there are places where it makes a lot of sense to actually pay a little bit of attention for why. For instance, recent work, among others, Carsey et al., Limbacher you, have shown that redrawn lines, as we were speaking about before, change the composition of the electorate and exert an exogenous effect on the vote. This is the argument that changing your district boundaries pseudo-exogenously change the types of people who are in a district and therefore the likely voters. But less attention has been paid to show how these changes might affect minority representation. So this is an opportunity for research concerned with political consequences of constituency boundaries to engage more directly with scholarship on minority representation. So this is one example that we pulled out and thought about and thought, actually, it makes sense that maybe if you change the people in a district, you might actually affect how minority representation might occur in that, therefore, those districts and the neighboring districts. What are questions that are under-empirically validated? Here, we're looking at the differences between bold edges and dashed edges, right? So, for instance, compactness has been hypothesized as influencing minority representation, but that also has not been empirically validated. So these are the sorts of questions that are, starting to tease in your mind. To some extent, you already at least have a sense, given a thorough literature review, is it answered? We also think that causal pathways that are related to a theorized concept can be discussed by simply drawing the neighborhood around the causal pathway that you're interested in. So simply zoom in the network on the places that you are thinking about doing research on. For instance, preserving communities of interest is often studied as a cause to roll-off and partisan gerrymandering, and has been theorized, but not empirically validated, to affect voters' information and fellow constituents. And ways to measure it, so this is the sort of self-ties, have also been explored. Now, to some extent, that means that if you're interested in, let's say, testing preserving communities of interest effects on voter information about their districts, if you're thinking about confounders, right? Here, it doesn't look like there's an obvious theoretical confounder that the literature has already posited for you. You might think about other ones, right? Things that actually do simultaneously affect this and try to control for it, try to handle it. But at least from this takeaway, we already can be reasonably sure that there isn't something that's very obvious in the literature that you should have handled, if that makes sense. So on the other hand, in a setting like this, where we're thinking about confounding for partisan advantage's effect on the efficiency gap, right? We're looking at, in this neighborhood, is there a concept node that is influencing both? And in fact, there is. Partisan gerrymandering is heavily posited theory and empirically to affect both efficiency gap and partisan advantage. So if you're just trying to isolate the causal effect of partisan advantage on efficiency gap, at minimum, you should be handling this node here. So hopefully this is an easy to take away message in looking at simply the network neighborhoods of your causal relationships. We also wanted to make sure that this approach, this network approach, wasn't going to deviate too far from what a traditional expert review should have looked like, right? We should have captured the things that would have been captured otherwise, and hopefully been able to add a little bit more, but we should be weakly similar. Ken Meyer conducted his own separate redistricting review. We asked him to independently separate himself from us throughout this entire process and write a review. And McGee 2020 was a review in the annual review of political science that also focused on redistricting. And so between the two of them, these experts, we found that they explored three key themes: developing metrics, so basically trying to measure things in redistricting, automation of redistricting methods, and exploring downstream effects of gerrymandering. So these are common themes in the last decade of redistricting literature in this sample. Our key takeaway is that the NetLit review finds the exact same three themes, which is very helpful, with some nuance. So we're able to further parse out where the metric scholarship contributes to redistricting theory. So remember those like lonesome nodes that self-tie? So there's a lot of redistricting literature currently that focuses on developing metrics to propose legal standards for courts, but only some of them are theorized to affect voter turnout. So to some extent, like measurement is important, but this hasn't been the core to theory development in the literature, which is useful to know. We also tend to avoid over-conflation of overall patterns of scholarship. So while there's been a lot of excitement about automated redistricting methods in the literature, so a lot of interesting work by Ben Fifield and Moon Duchin and Kosuke Imai, this is a substantial part of literature that has gotten a lot of attention. But it's actually a minority of the literature's landscape currently, especially in terms of, again, theory. That's not to say it's not important. It's just to keep it in context. This is not methods and automation are taking over all of the literature. It is an important development that is a minority, but substantial. A lot of exploration of gerrymandering effects on outcomes like incumbency advantage, electoral competition, candidate quality, et cetera. And the network graph that we're able to elicit suggests possibility to further illuminate downstream causal chains, confounding concepts, and multiple causal paths, which we think is super interesting as these sort of gnarly concepts are being thought about in conjunction with one another. So to just conclude, hopefully I've at least piqued your interest in one or two possibilities moving forward and thinking about how you might be able to use something like this, even if only in theory, not in practice. We present an organizing framework based on network representations to conduct literature reviews. This research builds on complex combinations of prior work, and a network approach might prove especially fruitful in that setting, right? So you have tons of literature that you're building up, and you're just going to keep adding to it and then just regenerate that network graph every time. So hopefully it lowers the barriers to entry for new or junior scholars to a topic. Hopefully I've highlighted some helpful features of networks for mapping scholarship. So what is your question? And then what that would look like in terms of asking a network question, and then what that would be visualized and how you would look at it. The proposed framework, though, still the same caveat, still relies on researcher choices. So this is the universe of sources, your selection criteria, and your identification of main concepts. And these are always going to be undertaken in your traditional reviews. But hopefully by clarifying those choices and utilizing our network framework to visualize the resulting literature, it may make it a little bit easier to evaluate whether those choices made sense and how sensitive your assertions about gaps in the literature are to them. So I'll end here and open up for questions, but thank you so much for your patience and your time.
Thank you so much. That's been so great. I'll wait a moment to see if other people have questions, and if not, I've got lots. Okay, Liza, thank you. The first thing that crossed my mind with everything you were saying was what you were talking about, how important this is to the transparency. And transparency has always been a massive issue with literature review. So this as a way of being able to manage that is really exciting. It gives me some hope for broader issues around theoretical validation. But the other part of it that was striking me was what you said at the very beginning in terms of as new research comes in and being able to um, not redo literature, because the typical process of doing literature review is very much a moment in time process. And it very much strikes me the huge potential of this to be able to create sort of auto identification within the journal databases, to have articles come up, to be able to build a process that's continually updating this over time, where you're not active, you're reading every piece, of course, but you're not having to do a reanalysis. It's hugely exciting just as an efficiency thing.
Yeah, I did say I was slightly motivated by my own laziness, but I do think that one of the nice things about, and thank you for highlighting this, one of the nice things about this from a junior scholar or someone who just doesn't have a ton of memory space is the ability to just every few years update your literature review and only add to it rather than redo the entire process altogether. One thing that I didn't mention in this talk, but which is in the vignette available online in our GitHub, which you can access through the QR code or through the paper associated to the talk, where hopefully one of the other things you can do in being able to look at this literature review over time is to basically parse it over time. And if you want to take an eagle's eyes look over 3 decades worth of the research as you're adding in, it's hopefully a natural output that you can look at. So what did the literature network look like in the 1990s versus the 2000s versus 2010s and versus 2020s, right? Those are essentially 4 distinct graphs that we can look at and compare. And to some extent, that's very exciting to be able to get a sense of like, where are things moving in the literature, and I think it's one of the key things that you see in an annual review piece. What has happened in the phases of history of this topic? And then where do you see that transition going in the next decade of work? So to some extent, we find that kind of useful. We also find it useful in being able to parse out. So this is in a different set of studies that we did just to assess biases, because obviously, as I mentioned before, you're always going to be biased based off of the types of works that you pull in for the sample. Hopefully you are clear about what you did, but to some extent, it'd be helpful to assess it. So what we looked at is, because you can always encode in as an edge attribute. So whether a particular edge between a first concept and a second concept is written about in a paper, an attribute of it is potentially if the authors are minority scholars, if they are female scholars, if they are from certain universities, et cetera. And you can also assess that, at least in your network, and get a sense of maybe it's still biased, but you could compare it over time, over different samples, and get a sense of what is it that you're representing? And is this maybe representative of the current literature as it stands? And at least we can challenge our own assumptions to some extent, even if it's not bulletproof. So those are things that we hope can be made a little bit easier in the process, but not bulletproof, as I said.
Yeah. It also strikes me another application of this is when you're working with concepts that exist across multiple fields and disciplines
Yes.
and are understood across them, that you can essentially code for these distinctions in the disciplinary research and be able to actually show the differentiation. So we have an applied research project coming up that I'm going to use this on. And I'm wildly excited about, because it looks at interventions in violence amongst gang affiliated youth. And what comes out of the literature around violence prevention is radically different than what comes out of the social work literature around interventions with at-risk youth. And so being able to actually compare the network maps, I think, is going to be this sort of rich treasure trove.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Can't believe I never thought of that.
No, that is really, so I hadn't thought of that particular style of comparison, but I think that will be really interesting, especially because the two disciplines have very different focuses. But it might contribute to different interactions that we wouldn't really be thinking about without that direct comparison. I had actually been speaking to a colleague of mine here who's in biology and microbiology. And she was saying that one of the key issues that they tend to have is that a lot of the biological sciences are studying different parts of a biological pathway and they're distinct literatures that don't interact with one another that much. But obviously, if you understand why certain chemical compositions work well together or don't interact poorly, it reflects back, for instance, on genetic makeup, on medical interventions, et cetera. And these are all things that are a little bit hard to get at if you only just read paper after paper, but hopefully can be a little bit easier when you're just doing a plug and chug lit review where you're just reading a paper, putting it in and letting the sort of graph part look for patterns rather than constantly trying to think about the patterns yourself. Yeah. Sorry, I think I see a question.
Oh, Sam?
Yes, I think there was a question in the chat before me. So
Yes. So Robbie asks, I think I heard you say minority representation is not widely studied, but that specifically in relation to race, but that is the core of the legal objection to partisan redistricting in the US. Is there really a gap in the literature here? What are courts leaning on?
So that's a really good question. I was shocked when we looked at the literature review. So there are a few parts to answer your question. The first is recall that we're only focusing on the last decade. So it could be that our attentions have not been paid enough on one of the core redistricting concepts that we ostensibly should be focusing on in talking about redistricting in total in the United States. That's one aspect. Second is political science is the main literature we've been focusing on here. My gut impulse / based off of the qualitative work that I've done in the legal scholarship is that has been discussed. So to some extent, I didn't have time for it in this talk. This is a discipline-based deviation that we see in our analysis and in our application that there has been understudy. Now, let me also contextualize what I mean by minority representation is not widely studied in this setting that we have. It is not widely studied in the sense that if you look at the entire graph network, it's not taking up a third of it or a fourth of it, what you would have maybe mentally have imagined as a huge constituent community of work in the literature network. There's still a dominant set of communities that are focused on the other concepts that are often related to redistricting. So these are the contiguity, proportionality, et cetera. So I should contextualize that, but I also do stand by the fact that we looked and we're just surprised. Now, if you think about where we're looking at, the context in which we're looking at it, and the fact that this literature does appear in political science, but it's just not as large as you would expect, then to me, that's challenging my assumption as a prior coming in. I had thought it would be a larger part of literature, and it is not as large as I thought it would be. So I thought that was an interesting takeaway for our group, but I'm also hopefully very clearly not a redistricting expert, learning as I go. So I'm happy to discuss on offline on places where you think we could further explore and include. One more question. So when I think of mapping the universe of literature on a specific topic, scoping reviews come to mind as a methodology. I don't think I'm familiar with scoping reviews. Would you mind clarifying what you mean by that?
You mean systematic review?
yeah, or like a systematic scoping review. I think very similar to a systematic review, but the end purpose isn't to run a meta-analysis, but rather to just characterize what literature is out there, its characteristics, and to identify gaps in literature. And maybe this is a more discipline-specific methodology.
I don't think there's, from what I can understand of its definition that you currently gave, I don't think there's any bad interaction with simply applying what we're doing as well with that goal in mind. So you might not care, for instance, about causal pathways, and you might not focus on communities, for instance. But if you want to systematically account for all of the pieces of the literature and then look at what are common concepts that are discussed or common theories that are reinforced over and over, this is something that hopefully can be of help in that process, and at least is both sort of Lego unit oriented. So you simply put in one row in an Excel spreadsheet as you move along, and also can be built upon. So hopefully to that extent, I think in terms of substance, it's very similar, but to the extent of being block by block and something you can build on, I think there is some benefit to utilizing our approach for the same goals. Yeah. Sorry, I think I see another question, Robbie.
I'll just follow up on that. Shad and I are both working on a scoping review together. There's a well-specified Prisma has a scoping review extension on this is how you conduct a scoping review. So it sets out a lot of the search criteria and what you have to do on the front end, but the network analysis is really interesting from a sense making perspective. And that would shape the way that you extract data if you're doing a scoping review or a systematic review, and thinking about what those edge characteristics are going to be and how you're going to visually represent your findings on the far end. So it's definitely intriguing. I think the two of them can go hand in hand. And the question is, what are you trying to do with your review? And is this the right tool to do it?
Got it. I had not heard of, I need to look more into scoping criteria, but that sounds really interesting. And it sounds like it's also a framework to think about what your sample universe looks like. And if it's also sort of something that you're super clear about, then that is exactly what we hope for in the first part of this methodology, which is just being really clear about what goes in. But we're agnostic about your choices. We just want that choice to be very clear. But it sounds like that the scoping approach is potentially a bit more guided, which is good. Thank you.
Great. I know we're a little bit over. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I could continue this conversation for a long time. Yes, this has been very interesting. Everyone, feel free if you are interested in applying this. We're going to be trying it in real time within Spark, and so happy to talk with you about it and reach out, Allie, if we get stuck.
Please do. Yeah.
All right. Take care. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you again. Bye.